Chapter 6. Examination Day. It was plain that Fred and Charlie had spread the news of their descent into the pit and of their battle with the Simpson clan and the fishes. He heard the 9 o'clock bell with feelings of relief, and passed into the school, a mark for admiring glances from all the boys. The girls, too, looked at him in a timid and fearful way, as they might have looked at Daniel when he came out of the lion's den, Joe thought, or at David after his battle with Goliath. It made him uncomfortable and painfully self-conscious, this hero-worshipping, and he wished heartily that they would look in some other direction for a change. Soon they did look in another direction. While big sheets of foolscap were being distributed to every desk, Miss Wilson, the teacher, an austere-looking young woman who went through the world as though it were a refrigerator, and who, even on the warmest days in the classroom, was to be found with a shawl or cape about her shoulders, arose, and on the blackboard where all could see wrote the Roman numeral I. Every eye, and there were 50 pairs of them, hung with expectancy upon her hand, and in the pause that followed the room was quiet as the grave. Underneath the Roman numeral I she wrote A. What were the laws of Draco? B. Why did an Athenian orator say that they were written not in ink but in blood? 49 heads bent down and 49 pens scratched lustily across as many sheets of foolscap. Joe's head alone remained up, and he regarded the blackboard with so blank a stare that Miss Wilson, glancing over her shoulder after having written I, stopped to look at him. Then she wrote A. How did the war between Athens and Megara respecting the island of Salamis bring about the reforms of Solon? B. In what way did they differ from the laws of Draco? She turned to look at Joe again. He was staring as blankly as ever. "What is the matter, Joe?" she asked. "Have you no paper?" "Yes, I have, thank you," he answered, and began moodily to sharpen a lead pencil. He made a fine point to it. Then he made a very fine point. Then, and with infinite patience, he proceeded to make it very much finer. Several of his classmates raised their heads inquiringly at the noise, but he did not notice. He was too absorbed in his pencil sharpening and in thinking thoughts far away from both pencil sharpening and Greek history. "Of course you all understand that the examination papers are to be written in ink." Miss Wilson addressed the class in general, but her eyes rested on Joe. Just as it was about as fine as it could possibly be, the point broke, and Joe began over again. "I'm afraid, Joe, that you annoy the class," Miss Wilson said in final desperation. He put the pencil down, closed the knife with a snap, and returned to his blank staring at the blackboard. What did he know about Draco, or Solon, or the rest of the Greeks? It was a flunk, and that was all there was to it. No need for him to look at the rest of the questions, and even if he did know the answers to 2 or 3, there was no use in writing them down. It would not prevent the flunk. Besides, his arm hurt too much to write. It hurt his eyes to look at the blackboard, and his eyes hurt even when they were closed, and it seemed positively to hurt him to think. So the 49 pens scratched on in a race after Miss Wilson, who was covering the blackboard with question after question, and he listened to the scratching and watched the questions growing under her chalk, and was very miserable indeed. His head seemed whirling around. It ached inside and was sore outside, and he did not seem to have any control of it at all. He was beset with memories of the pit, like scenes from some monstrous nightmare, and try as he would, he could not dispel them. He would fix his mind and eyes on Miss Wilson's face, who was now sitting at her desk, and even as he looked at her, The face of Brick Simpson, impudent and pugnacious, would arise before him. It was of no use. He felt sick and sore and tired and worthless. There was nothing to be done but flunk, and when, after an age of waiting, the papers were collected, his went in a blank, save for his name, the name of the examination, and the date, which were written across the top. After a brief interval, more papers were given out, and the examination in arithmetic began. He did not trouble himself to look at the questions. Ordinarily he might have pulled through such an examination, but in his present state of mind and body he knew it was impossible. He contented himself with burying his face in his hands and hoping for the noon hour. Once, lifting his eyes to the clock, he caught Bessie looking anxiously at him across the room from the girl's side. This but added to his discomfort. Why was she bothering him? No need for her to trouble. She was bound to pass. Then why couldn't she leave him alone? So he gave her a particularly glowering look, and buried his face in his hands again. Nor did he lift it till the 12 o'clock gong rang, when he handed in a second blank paper and passed out with the boys. Fred and Charlie and he usually ate lunch in a corner of the yard which they had arrogated to themselves, but this day, by some remarkable coincidence, a score of other boys had elected to eat their lunch on the same spot. He surveyed them with disgust. In his present condition he did not feel inclined to receive hero worship. His head ached too much, and he was troubled over his failure in the examinations. And there was more to come in the afternoon. He was angry with Fred and Charlie. They were chattering like magpies over the adventures of the night, in which, however, they did not fail to give him chief credit, and they conducted themselves in quite a patronizing fashion toward their awed and admiring schoolmates. But every attempt to make Joe talk was a failure. He grunted and gave short answers, and said yes and no to questions asked with the intention of drawing him out. He was longing to get away somewhere by himself, to throw himself down some place on the green grass and forget his aches and pains and troubles. He got up to go and find such a place, and found half a dozen of his following tagging after him. He wanted to turn around and scream at them to leave him alone, but his pride restrained him. A great wave of disgust and despair swept over him, and then an idea flashed through his mind. Since he was sure to flunk in his examinations, why endure the afternoon's torture, which could not but be worse than the morning's? And on the impulse of the moment he made up his mind. He walked straight on to the schoolyard gate and passed out. Here his worshippers halted in wonderment, but he kept on to the corner and out of sight. For some time he wandered along aimlessly till he came to the tracks of a cable road. A downtown car happened to stop to let off passengers. He stepped aboard and ensconced himself in an outside corner seat. The next thing he was aware of, the car was swinging around on its turntable, and he was hastily scrambling off. The big ferry building stood before him. Seeing and hearing nothing, he had been carried through the heart of the business section of San Francisco. He glanced up at the tower clock on top of the ferry building. It was 10 minutes after 1, time enough to catch the 1:15 boat. That decided him, and without the least idea in the world as to where he was going, he paid 10 cents for a ticket, passed through the gate, and was soon speeding across the bay to the pretty city of Oakland. In the same aimless and unwitting fashion he found himself an hour later sitting on the string piece of the Oakland City wharf and leaning his aching head against a friendly timber. From where he sat he could look down upon the decks of a number of small sailing craft. Quite a crowd of curious idlers had collected to look at them, and Joe found himself growing interested. There were 4 boats, and from where he sat he could make out their names. The one directly beneath him had the name Ghost painted in large green letters on its stern. The other 3 which lay beyond were called respectively La Caprice, the Oyster Queen, and the Flying Dutchman. Each of these boats had cabins built amidships, with short stovepipes projecting through the roofs, and from the pipe of the Ghost smoke was ascending. The cabin doors were open and the roof slide pulled back so that Joe could look inside and observe the inmate, a young fellow of 19 or 20, who was engaged just then in cooking. He was clad in long sea boots which reached the hips, blue overalls, and dark woolen shirt. The sleeves, rolled back to the elbows, disclosed sturdy, sun-bronzed arms, and when the young fellow looked up his face proved to be equally bronzed and tanned. The aroma of coffee arose to Joe's nose, and from a light iron pot came the unmistakable smell of beans nearly done. The cook placed a frying pan on the stove, wiped it around with a piece of suet when it was heated, and tossed in a thick chunk of beefsteak. While he worked he talked with a companion on deck, who was busily engaged in filling a bucket overside and flinging the salt water over heaps of oysters that lay on the deck. This completed, he covered the oysters with wet sacks and went into the cabin, where a place was set for him on a tiny table, and where the cook served the dinner and joined him in eating it. All the romance of Joe's nature stirred at the sight. That was life. They were living, and gaining their living out in the free open, under the sun and sky, with the sea rocking beneath them and the wind blowing on them or the rain falling on them as the chance might be. Each day and every day he sat in a room pent up with 50 more of his kind, racking his brains and cramming dry husks of knowledge, while they were doing all this, living glad and careless and happy, rowing boats and sailing and cooking their own food, and certainly meeting with adventures such as one only dreams of in the crowded schoolroom. Joe sighed. He felt that he was made for this sort of life, and not for the life of a scholar. As a scholar he was undeniably a failure. He had flunked in his examinations, while at that very moment he knew Bessie was going triumphantly home, her last examination over and done, and with credit. Oh, it was not to be borne. His father was wrong in sending him to school. That might be well enough for boys who were inclined to study, but it was manifest that he was not so inclined. There were more careers in life than that of the schools. Men had gone down to the sea in the lowest capacity, and risen in greatness, and owned great fleets, and done great deeds, and left their names on the pages of time. And why not he, Joe Bronson? He closed his eyes and felt immensely sorry for himself. And when he opened his eyes again, he found that he had been asleep, and that the sun was sinking fast. It was after dark when he arrived home, and he went straight to his room and to bed without meeting anyone. He sank down between the cool sheets with a sigh of satisfaction at the thought that, come what would, he need no longer worry about his history. Then another and unwelcome thought obtruded itself, and he knew that the next school term would come, and that 6 months thereafter another examination in the same history awaited him. End of chapter 6.